Hi, I'm Nick. Welcome to Atoms for Peace channel, and the third video in this series on UFOs, global warming, and nukes. If this is your first time here, please consider starting with my first and second videos, the links to which I'll put in the description below. I'm going to start off by admitting that I've been at a bit of a loss as to how to proceed with these videos. It's not that we're out of ground to cover, it's that it's difficult to know what ground would be most helpful to cover next.
I could dig into my previous work for the labs, and how I developed my perspective on our energy and security crisis. I could talk about the problem with most liberals' approach to greenhouse gas mitigation, which is still stuck in the realm of wishful thinking.
We both believe in decarbonization, right? Climate change is a problem.
Yes.
And we sort of see the pathway on that is we have to build a lot of green energy to reorient our economy so you can run a modern economy on a green energy basis. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. So to do that, you have to move all this energy production over to renewable sources, and then you have to get the energy from where it currently is, right? A solar farm, a wind farm, a hydroelectric, project, whatever it is, and run it through transmission lines to where we plug shit into the wall and charge it. I have done a lot of coverage.
I could talk about the madness in attaching ourselves to a defensive strategy and nuclear posture that holds the entire world hostage, literally at gunpoint, in perpetuity. A strategy that is doomed to fail, to produce cataclysmic levels of destruction and human suffering. I could talk about nuclear fuel cycles and how the International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards sensitive materials. How analysts assess the proliferation sensitivity of different facilities, or why it makes the most sense, economically, environmentally, and from a national security standpoint, to build big gigawatt-scale light water reactors, rather than invest in the development of exotic new smaller ones. I could talk about the twisted worldview and ethos of our intelligence community, a community that has done more harm to people in this country and others than it has done to serve or protect anyone. A provocative claim, maybe, but we need only look at the record to discover this. To discover decades of middling to poor collections and analysis, alongside a truly appalling history of covert operations and thuggish criminality.
I could drill into interviews with popular intelligence community pundits that are packed full of flags for sociopathy and malignant narcissism. Interviews full of doublespeak, mealy-mouthed, moral relativism, and various other rhetorical devices used by the indoctrinated to excuse patently heinous behavior.
They recognize that good or bad is irrelevant. They recognize that it's all about the chase, right? It's all about not choosing the easy option. You know Matt Cox. Matt Cox and I met and became pretty fast friends, not because of anything other than the fact that he was a freaking criminal.
Yeah.
And I was a criminal legalized by a code in the United States.
Hold on a second.
Yeah.
You were a criminal legalized by a code in the United States. What do you mean by that?
That's what a spy is, dude. A spy is given the ability to do criminal acts in the best interest of national security.
Which you're not purposely calling good or bad because you don't know what is.
Well, not because I don't know, because I know that if you look at it through one lens, it's good. If you look at it through a different lens, it's bad.
I could dive deeper into how this sort of language and thinking leads to gross human rights abuses, to the routinized drugging of unwitting civilians, to assassinations of political leaders, to the training and arming of military juntas and the aiding and abetting of genocide.
And a member of the CIA, somebody who's an immigrant.
Immigrants that are here illegally have no American protection.
So they can actually rape them.
Well, that's a great question again.
I could talk about the benefits of norm building, about why it's in our national interest to fulfill our treaty commitments and observe international law. I could explain why rigging radios and beepers to explode is an act of terrorism and a war crime. Certainly not something that any moral person, intelligence official or not, would go on record admiring.
Can you say that? Can you say it's a war crime? And I said, well, no, I think the point is that this is probably one of the most brilliant acts of genius operational planning I've ever seen in my life. Right. Imagine the moving parts involved in an operation like.
I could talk about why Greta Thunberg, who is an activist but who is far from radical, is also a lightning rod for attacks from overconfident, ego-blind men.
So some people are like, how dare you do that? You know, and probably Greta will be angry with this and like, you've taken my future. But fuck her.
Yes. How dare you? How dare you steal my dreams?
My childhood.
My childhood.
What a narcissistic thing to say.
So with Greta Thunberg, you see a sort of infantile extremism.
It's the opposite of the picture of Baconian science from the 17th, 18th century, where, you know, the Antichrist is like some evil tech genius, evil scientist who invents this machine to take over the world. People are way too scared for that. In our world, it's far more likely to be Greta Thunberg.
I could talk about my issues with the UAP Disclosure Act and why I believe our focus on recovered materials is, for the time being anyway, misled.
These are all relevant topics for discussion, all worthy of much deeper dives. Some suggested that I start by focusing on my field of expertise, that I start with a primer on nuclear power and weapons-sensitive components of the fuel cycle. And I could do that. I intend to do that. But what I've learned from years of engaging folks on these subjects is that whatever work on ourselves we've neglected, whatever unacknowledged darkness and ignorance persists inside of us, those parts of ourselves will manifest in unpredictable ways. And you can bet that strong feelings will accompany those instances. In those cases when we find the offending information threatening enough to our persona, our tribe, to our image of our spouse or whatever else we're clinging to, we will attack the source.
When we're confronted with truths that we find repulsive or unacceptable, negative feelings flood our experience and the darkness inside of us grabs the reins to our executive functions. This is how our undiscovered self finds agency, through the compulsive validation of our strongest emotions. So when I travel into these topical areas of discussion, into personal or controversial issues, I am keenly aware that I'm at the same time opening myself up to attacks from those with incompatible beliefs and convictions. Each issue is filled with snags and hang-ups for those with unresolved attachments, whether to the promise of a renewables-driven economy, to a romanticized view of espionage, the CIA, or the national security state, to anti-gravity technologies, or to a worldview free of the existence of higher powers. Even our affinity for certain politicians or charismatic YouTube personalities might trigger strong negative emotions and resistance to the offending information. Only once we've let go of our attachments, all of them, and set about rebuilding our understanding from the ground up, can we find our way to clarity and deeper insight.
This is why I'm moving so slowly into this content, and why I've spent the better part of 2 videos addressing the importance of developing an honest self-image and establishing our basic values and intentions.
Take, for example, efforts to emotionalize Greta Thunberg, to psychologize her behavior and activism. What has she said and done to warrant your attacks, gentlemen? Your hostile diagnosis? What abuse has she committed? If you are attached to a view of environmental activists, or perhaps all activists, as narcissistic blowhards, as self-promoting, posturing hypocrites, might this impair your ability to distinguish the righteous among them from the self-righteous? If you have no insight into Greta's motivations or personal life, her meaning to those around her, then what is it about her public persona, her public statements and actions that you find so reprehensible? In the words of Carl Jung, the emotional emotionalize others. So if it is simply her judgmentalism, her plain-spoken condemnation of evil, might your problem be that she is correct, that this young woman's moral outrage is righteous, authentic, and warranted?
We can also take the example of the UAP Disclosure Act, sponsored by Senators Chuck Schumer and Mike Rounds. Effective UAP legislation will target the conspiracy to conceal not just the exotic materials themselves, but the decades of military engagements and activities that produced them. So, upon learning that someone, anyone, possesses alien spacecraft or other non-human technologies, shouldn't our priority be to learn the circumstances under which these materials were acquired.
Where is the language probing into the status of our relations with the originating intelligence? Considering that we have let our warfighters determine our foreign policy with regard to our cosmic guests, we should expect that it has not been one of restraint, but one defined by the worldview and objectives of a select few within the Department of Defense. So, assuming we can establish as fact the U.S. government's possession of extraterrestrial technologies, and assuming that, in doing so, we also expose a conspiracy to conceal decades of military interactions with visiting species, the next line of inquiry will have nothing to do with the materials themselves, but must shift immediately to the matter of our behavior. We must ask what violence we have done, what violence we are still doing to advance the interests of warmongers and profiteers under the pretense of serving the national security interest. The last thing that we should be concerning ourselves with, in other words, as national security analysts, investigative journalists, or conscientious citizens, is the validity of anyone's legal claim to any recovered hardware.
But then also, what is the criteria for shooting something down in the sky now? Because that to me is actually the bigger question.
So I think it'll just be we'll transmit these parameters within coming days. It won't be very, very long, and it's not like it's going to be sent to be debated on or voted on. It's going to be our parameters defined by the National Security Council team and the interagency on how we're going to deal with this.
The following are appropriate questions to ask at this point. Are taxpayer dollars being used to attack non-human intelligences? Are defense contractors complicit in these attacks? Have any defense contractors benefited materially from unlawful efforts to shoot down and recover ET craft? Again, if we suspect that even a single item of extraterrestrial origin was acquired through hostile acts of aggression, then our inquiries should be aimed squarely at exposing the greed and corruption that permitted this utterly reckless behavior to persist in secret for decades.
In my last video, I made the case that we've lost touch as a society with our values and the truth, a consequence of which being that we are left with nothing to anchor ourselves to when we are confronted with uncertainty and the unknown. Rather than establish clear values or an authentic self-image, things that would insulate us from extreme disorientation and shock under such circumstances, we have distracted ourselves with various attachments. Some accumulate great wealth, some a deep subject matter expertise, some covet their titles or professional networks, some worship at the feet of a narcissistic spouse or a charismatic boss. The constraints we put on our worldview are tolerable only as long as the world conforms to them. The more of these attachments we accumulate and identify with, the more constrained and entrenched we become in our mindset and attitude, so that information that threatens our relationship to these things, or to our view of them as worthy objects, becomes increasingly inaccessible and undesirable.
When we are confronted with great uncertainty and crisis, the unworthy things to which we have attached ourselves become crippling. The truth is that our attachments make us brittle, so that when we are forcibly stripped of them, when we are faced with a true crisis, we are left impotent and rudderless. To avoid this condition, we must take the time to define a worthy set of values that transcend our unworthy attachments, values that we can return to over the course of our lives and that regularly guide our behavior. Only by doing this can we develop a robust character and identity that can withstand great uncertainty, loss, and confrontation with the unknown. I hope this makes some sense. If not, please revisit episodes 1 and 2 where I cover this ground more thoroughly. Again, this stuff is critical to understand before moving on to any practical discussion related to policy, whether we're talking about our energy and security policies or protocols for contact with UFOs.
With regard to the apparent ambitiousness of these policies, it's also important not to get overwhelmed, not to feel upon waking up to our circumstances and immediate responsibilities cynical about our current trajectory or our ability to course correct in time to avoid catastrophe. An argument I've heard often goes something like this. I don't like our circumstances either, Nick, but I don't think we have any real power to change them. Suppose I agreed with you, that we shouldn't be shooting at UFOs, that we should fulfill our disarmament commitments and drastically cut carbon emissions. What are any of us to do about it? For the time being, nothing, actually. Not yet, at least. Until we've bridged the distance between what we believe is true and what appears to be true, we should do nothing. It's really about the beginning of this question. Suppose I agreed with you. Only by developing your own view to the problems I'm articulating, developing your own insight into the truth and gravity of our circumstances, can you discover what you might do about it, how you might best contribute. It's not my place to tell you these things. We all have to find our way to our own understanding before we can be in any way instrumental to a political movement or to affecting major policy changes. So, some questions to consider before I spell out the basics of my own understanding.
Do you remain unconvinced of the relationship between man-made carbon emissions and catastrophic global warming? If so, I would offer that the truth of this relationship is evident, and that it's up to you to find and resolve the obstacle to your understanding before expecting to benefit from any practical discussion of various greenhouse gas mitigation strategies. Do you not see the inherent limitations of renewables? I would offer that these too are evident. Do you deny the apocalyptic threat posed by our current nuclear posture, by our continued deployment of thousands of thermonuclear weapons? Again, why not? The truth and immediacy of this threat is evident as well. Do you not understand modern UFOs to represent the arrival of higher powers? To be clear, the question isn't why you would believe such a thing, but why, given the available information, you do not. Intelligent beings piloting advanced spacecraft are exactly what UFOs appear to be. The truth of this, too, is evident. Until we've bridged the distance between what we want to believe and what is apparent, between what we want to believe about UFOs and what these objects are, who our visitors are, we are not in a position to do anything. We don't need any classified information or supernatural abilities to see and react appropriately to our circumstances. We simply need to teach ourselves to let in the truth. The first step is personal, not public. To know what to do about UFOs, where to direct our energies and activism, we have to update our understanding of what these objects represent. And, as cliché as this might sound, developing our understanding of UFOs requires that we go inward, toward a deeper relationship with ourselves.
Once we have this, honest service is easy, and the basics of what to do become obvious. Once more of us awaken and orient around a shared set of interests, we can work together effectively to serve and save the things we value, to advocate for pragmatic, necessary changes to our energy and security policies. If we focus our attention here, on resolving the existential threats we've created for ourselves, we'll find ourselves naturally growing into alignment with the values and interests of our visitors, the vast majority of whom very much want us to succeed at this, to survive the present moment and grow into the stewards and ambassadors that this planet needs. As we do this, as we set to work solving our problems and saving the life here, we will be paving the way for our own integration into a much larger community of good, like-minded servants to creators and creation.
As our technologies and technocrats grow more powerful, however, it will grow harder to focus our attention and resources on solving our most basic problems. There are several reasons for this. First is that these problems grow more stubborn and intractable as they age. As policy positions become more entrenched, more wedded to one or another political identity, inertia alone can convert a crisis into a status quo condition. This is true both of our strategic defense doctrine, which has put us under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation since the dawn of the Cold War, and anthropogenic climate change, which many have grown to regard as less of a crisis than an inevitable cost of development. These two threats are our largest ones. And yet, because we've gone so long without making any substantial commitment or progress towards solving them, they've begun to take a back seat to newer, more novel ones. Take artificial intelligence, for example. We might look at the pace of development in the AI space and see this as the defining issue of our times. How do we deploy this powerful new technology responsibly? How do we protect the livelihood of those whose jobs have been upended, or whose careers have been critically disrupted by AI services? How do we protect ourselves against malicious AI-generated content? What are we to make of the enormous new water and energy demands associated with this burgeoning industry? These are seemingly pressing questions, and there are many more competing for our attention. What about the ubiquity of smartphones in our lives, the effects of social media on our kids, or the increasing use of smart tablets in place of books in public schools? Upon entering middle school, my kids were issued iPads. They have no textbooks, but they are expected to spend many hours a week on these devices. Is this really in their best interest? Is their education and mental health improved by this development?
All of these technological changes in our lives and the lives of our children are consequential. However, they are secondary to a more important, more fundamental issue that we've neglected to address for decades: the issue of our mental health. This, I would offer, lies at the root of our inability to see or act on the gravest existential threats that we face as a society, neither of which is new or novel.
You might roll your eyes at this. However, the modern state of affairs is so bad that, even if you are among those getting therapy, there is a reasonable probability that your therapist is, him or herself, among the afflicted. Here again, I'm aware that my words might irritate many of you, but I would ask, as I have before, for your patience in considering what I'm bringing to light here. Talk therapy can certainly be beneficial, but only for those lucky enough to have found and built relationships with competent clinicians. I use the word lucky because most people seeking therapy are unqualified to evaluate the competence of a prospective therapist. In fact, many seeking help do so because they have been betrayed or abused by those closest to them, by people they trusted. Domestic abusers include many intelligent, charismatic, and accomplished professionals, not to the exclusion, by the way, of mental health professionals. In light of this, consider how senseless it is not to mandate psychological evaluations for practicing psychotherapists. Consider how easy it would be for someone with unresolved trauma of their own, or an undiagnosed personality disorder, to drastically worsen the condition of their patients. Our influence in the world and the impacts of our words and actions are constrained by the limits of our awareness and understanding. So, before asking how we can contribute, this is where we have to start. We have to develop an authentic self-image, nail down our values, and gain a basic understanding of our circumstances. Then we can have confidence in our intentions and collaborate with others to serve higher ends. If we put in the effort to define what matters most to us, and if our service, however flawed, is earnest and authentic, then we will be in a position to goal set and take the measure of our contributions. A significant portion of near-death experiencers report undergoing a life review upon dying. However, we need not pass over to reflect honestly on our behavior. If we can achieve an authentic and fully integrated character, we will be positioned to evaluate our actions and treatment of others over the course of our lives. We will be empowered to do this by virtue of our authenticity, our tolerance for the truth, and our genuine desire to do good in the world. These traits allow us to reconcile our values and intentions with our impacts on the things we mean to serve. If we are honest, we will welcome insight into the experiences of others, into the impacts of our actions on those around us. If we identify as good parents, we will welcome insight into the experiences of our children. If we identify as good teachers, we will welcome insight into the experiences of our students. We will welcome these perspectives for the sake of our own learning and growth, and for the sake of better serving the things we value. As an example, let's talk for a moment about Jeffrey Epstein. The uncomfortable truth is that the key difference between Epstein and most men isn't their appetites, but their behavior. It should come as no surprise that many men find nubile women attractive. We do not pursue them or treat them as sexual objects, however, because they are not yet adults. Sexually mature though they may be, these are vulnerable members of society who cannot consent to and must be protected against the sexual advances of predatory men. Epstein, by contrast, took pride in acting on his appetites without restraint. He likely believed that the only thing stopping other men from acting similarly was that they lacked the courage and means to do so. By mocking our shame, our denial of our base appetites, Epstein goaded other men of wealth and influence to acknowledge and indulge these darker parts of themselves. This is what power is, he might have said. What separates us from weaker men is our willingness to go out and get what we really want. Epstein would have made a compelling case to self-centered men of privilege, men who would have found great convenience in dismissing notions of absolute morality or any basic distinction between good and evil. Epstein seated his identity in the human animal, in hedonistic experience, rather than in the human spirit. His was a worship of self, not of any transcendent cause or good. To gain wealth and influence and remain good people, we need to know the truth of our appetites, these evident features of our human condition, and the danger posed by pursuing and identifying with them. We must recognize our darkest desires to appreciate our vulnerability to evil, to going out and doing real harm and violence in the world. To reward evil thoughts and fantasies amounts to self-abuse. To act out on them moves our internal experience into the physical world, into the moral realm. How we treat ourselves, what thoughts we entertain, where we anchor our mind and consciousness during times of pain and darkness, these are psychological and spiritual questions. How we conduct ourselves, our choices, words, and actions, this is where the rubber meets the road, the moral realm, and the battleground between good and evil.
Second only to the fear of their exposure and humiliation, the most terrifying prospect in the imagination of the narcissist is that of living a moral life. These people want exceptional lives, so they adopt the identities of exceptional people. People to whom basic ethics, laws, and norms do not apply. They elevate themselves and their personal experiences to the top of their value structure, making themselves the object of their worship, their service. Their seeking is always in pursuit of pleasurable experiences or validation of their own superior self-image. They quietly obsess over their mortality, a pathology that stems from a view of reality and truth that exists nowhere outside of their own provincial lives and felt experience, their own story.
We all want meaningful lives. However, we fool ourselves by thinking that this requires a superior self-image, that we position ourselves above others, as better than others. The truth is that there is no such thing as an ordinary person. But by trying to escape this designation, we diminish ourselves. We reduce our meaning to a position within an imagined hierarchy. This obsession over status blinds us to our creative value and alienates us from others. We are each exceptional, each extraordinary, each irreplaceable. It cannot be otherwise. But by thinking of ourselves and our worth in strictly relative terms, rather than as intrinsically valuable, conscious creators, we miss out on the truth of ourselves, the truth of our limitless potential to create new meaning and to inspire and enrich the lives of others. We all have measurable traits and attributes, differing physical characteristics and abilities. But by over-focusing on these things, we miss out on who and what we are. We are creators. An animal in the wild will either succeed in their role as a progenitor of their species or they won't. And this is determined largely by measurable traits. where individuals exhibit weaknesses relative to their peers. They expose themselves to higher mortal risks and a higher likelihood of failure at this basic mission to survive and reproduce. As animals, we are driven by the same objectives. However, as humans, our success is determined by far more than this. Someone can be a wildly successful animal, having lots of offspring from lots of partners, and outcompeting most everyone around them for resources, while also failing miserably at being a successful human. The extent to which we grow, uplift, and enrich the lives of others, the extent to which we realize our own moral voice and agency, the extent to which we are able to realize our own creative potential and foster the same in others, our success at being a good human, in other words, is determined by our choices. What does it mean that your creative potential is infinite? Don't reduce this to some trope or platitude. The things that enrich our lives, the most meaningful things, come from a place of immeasurable depth. Think here of the songs and books we keep returning to, the ones that seem magically to capture a part of us, part of the essence of our human experience. There are ways to measure the skills of a guitarist, a drummer, or vocalist. But is it sensible to use these metrics to predict who will produce your favorite music? Who will write and perform the songs that speak to your soul and punctuate your fondest memories? Of course not. How, then, might we presume to measure anyone's creative potential? We cannot. We cannot know what any child's impact will be in the lives of others, or what will be his future contributions to society. This immeasurable value, this latent meaning in a young Bob Dylan, Viktor Frankl, or Martin Luther King, is the Christ force within us, and what we mean by a person's infinite creative potential. There are infinitely deep wells of meaning and creative potential all around us, and if we are wise, we will learn to recognize, value, and protect these things.
The goal of this channel is not to indoctrinate or radicalize anyone, but to build a community of like-minded people who love humanity and the life on this planet. I believe that our basic moral responsibilities are to these things, to creators and creation, that anyone can choose to identify with the good and gain the clarity of purpose and insight afforded through earnest service. Articulating the things we most value and working to save them is not radical. Greta Thunberg is not a radical. It is not idealistic to seek to preserve the conditions into which we are born. It is only practical. Maintaining the status quo is a decidedly unambitious goal, a reasonable bar against which to measure the health of our society and the quality of our contributions. Are we makers or destroyers? Agents of creation or chaos? At a bare minimum, claiming the identity of a creator and together a creative society requires that we not bake ourselves to a crisp or nuke ourselves into oblivion. Surely we can concede this. Surely we can concede that carbon dioxide is the dominant atmospheric greenhouse gas, and that we are responsible for spiking global levels to heights not seen on this planet for tens of millions of years. Surely we are knowledgeable and intelligent enough to understand that this will produce cataclysmic ecological consequences if left unmitigated. Surely we can concede, without the ingenuity of physicists, without the will and energy to build and maintain thousands of nuclear weapons, the threat posed to humanity and life on this planet from nuclear war would not exist. So what are we doing? I mean this sincerely. What are we doing? We can create anything we can imagine, but we're instead toying with suicide. The survival of our global society and the livability of this planet is threatened by two things. Both are of our own making. Both are painfully solvable. We are absolutely capable of removing these threats and flourishing, of becoming good stewards and neighbors to one another.
If anything is clear from Robert Hastings' book UFOs and Nukes, it's the insanity of our strategic defense doctrine and continued deployment of these apocalyptic weapons. Deterrence theory is a bedrock principle for modern-day statists, that hawkish group of pseudo-intellectuals who love advertising their ruthless pragmatism and wax endlessly about the cold calculus of great power politics. These are people who flaunt their access and speak in jargon, who've built careers for themselves, wittingly or not, propping up the interests of elites. Theirs is an ideology of American exceptionalism, of routinely carrying water for oppressive and tyrannical power structures. Again, we need only consult the record of our own appalling behavior to grasp the moral depravity of this community and the twisted worldview of its propagandists. These are people who paint the world as chaotic and orderless and work hard to keep it that way. After all, it is only in a lawless world of zero-sum transactions that inhumane attitudes and policies that favor the powerful and dehumanize the weak, can continue unchecked.
And they said, so this is a war crime, right? And I said, well, yeah, technically, because, we know of several cases where the guy that had the pager took the pager off his belt, put it on the table, sat down with his family to have dinner. The pager blew up and killed the 9-year-old daughter, right? So technically, yeah, that's a war crime.
Modern American statists like to cast themselves and their thinking as ruthlessly practical. However, it is only selfish, anti-progressive, and destructive. In time, it will also prove suicidal. Their pathway to lasting peace is not through trust-building, diplomacy, or trade, but through the constant projection of the credible threat of violence and destruction. As leaders of the free world, it is now also our job, apparently, to threaten everyone, everywhere, all the time. So, once again, what are we doing? That we have created this suicide button and insist on doing this insane juggling act over top of it is perverse and reckless enough. It certainly isn't sustainable. But upon learning that we have no control over these weapons, that any of our cosmic guests might drop in and push the button for us, what possible justification do we have left for maintaining them?
What possible good could come of the continued deployment of these world-ending weapons? Forget the game theory for a moment. Forget what balance to our global system you think might be afforded by holding a loaded gun to our head. What is it that you really think we risk by removing it? Because the truth is that we risk any shred of hope for a livable future by failing to do so. Until next time, love and hope.
So you know what? Why don't we just be good stewards of the thing? And if we broke something, let's fix it.